Okay, let's start by maximizing the perspective viewport, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a floor throw scene. So for that I'm going to go to the command panel, to the create option, create geometry, and I'm going to select a plane. And I'm going to draw that into the viewport. I want to be able to see what I'm doing at the moment, so I'm going to press the F3 key to toggle to wireframe mode. F4 will toggle, F3 will toggle between wireframe and shaded, and F4 will turn on wireframe when you're in shaded mode. So for now we'll just use wireframe, and you can see I've placed the ground plane in the scene. Now at the moment I'd like to have that placement to be a little bit more accurate, and you can see that it's not quite centered on the center of the world here, it's slightly off. So you'll notice at the bottom of the viewport you have the three transformation axes here, and if you change to rotation or scale, it will also show the current scale of the object, or rotation, whatever mode it is that you have your transforms in. So for now I'm going to put it back into transform mode, and you can see that the center of the plane is not quite in the center of the world, so I'm going to actually zero those values, so it's going to be x0, y0 and z0, and that will put the plane in the center of the world. And I can do that by right clicking on these spinners here. You can see if I move the spinner up and down by holding the left mouse button and moving up and down on it, it works as a normal spinner, and you can just dial up and down the values there. Oops, it's actually shot off there. There we are. That's brought it back. But as I said, we're going to zero the value, and you can do that by just right clicking on the spinner. So there we go, that's zero that value, and that's zero that value. So now our plane is set up to be in the dead center of the world. I want our plane to be a little bit larger, so I'm going to go to the modify panel, and you can see there are parameters here for the plane. Two of the main parameters for the plane are its length and its width, which you can see at the moment are 140.282 and 141.093. They're sort of arbitrary numbers because, as you saw, I just drew the plane in the viewport, so I want to get something a little bit more accurate, so I'm going to select that number and change that to 500, and I'm going to change the width to 500 as well. And as you can see, it's scaled out from its pivot. The pivot stays in the same place and the object will just scale around it. I shouldn't really actually call that a scale, because what I've actually done there is change one of the creation parameters. So no actual scaling is involved. I've just actually made the ground plane 500 units by 500 units, rather than, say, creating it at 100 by 100 and then scaling up by 500% to make it 500 by 500. And those two things are actually quite different, which you may actually see later in the tutorial. So there we go, we've got our ground plane, and it's at the right scale that we want it for the rest of the tutorial. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the plane, right click on it, which brings up the quad box, and up in this part of the quad box you can see I've got unfreeze all and freeze selection. Because it's quite easy to select the ground plane while I'm working in the rest of the tutorial, and I don't want to do that until later when I texture it. I'm going to freeze it for now, and all that will do is it'll turn it grey, and I won't be able to select the ground plane from now on. So that's actually quite useful, so we're going to do that for now. Okay, there we go. The ground plane's frozen, you can see it's gone grey, and if I try to select it, you can see it's not actually possible anymore. Okay, so let's go back to the creation panel, and I'm going to create a box now. So select on the standard primitives box, and I'm going to make this box 4x4 units. So I'm just going to roughly do that by drawing on the grid. There we go. And now draw the height, and there we are, we've got our cube. Same technique, I want to center it in the world, so I'm going to right click on the transform values down here. That's centered it in the world, and I want it to be exactly 40 by 40 units, so I'm going to type in the values here again. So there we go. That's great. Something I want to do as well is I want to actually have more faces on the cube, so that when I model the cube later it's a bit more conducive to what I want to actually model. So I'm going to change the tessellation on each face to 4. There we go. So we've now got our tessellated cube, and that's ready to model in the next step of our tutorial. Okay, to continue, I need to convert this cube, which at the moment is a parametric object. And by parametric, what I mean is that I can click on the cube and I can change the tessellation values of the faces. I can change the scale of the cube. I can change these things at any time I want. Now, the only limitation with that is that to modify the cube, I would have to put a modifier on it by going to the list of modifiers and applying a modifier. And I don't always want to do that. Applying a modifier does have a hit on performance. So you really don't want to apply a modifier for absolutely everything. You only really want to apply them where they're needed. So it's actually possible to convert a parametric object into any other type of what I would call a primitive object in Max by right-clicking on it, bringing up the quad box, and at the bottom you see you've got a sub-menu which is called Convert To, and here you have options to convert to editable mesh, editable poly, editable patch, or convert it to a NURBS object. Now, I think it will pay to have a little bit of a description about what each one of these object types is. Editable patch and NURBS, they in themselves are actually parametric surfaces. That means that the polygons that you actually see in the viewport aren't necessarily going to be the same polygons that you'll see in a render. And both of these surface types are designed so that you can use quite a low tessellation in the viewport, and then at render time they'll both get tessellated to much higher levels to produce a much finer result during render. It could be said that when you see them in the viewport, all you're seeing is a polygonal representation of a mathematical surface, which is pretty much what they are. So in effect, if you change this cube into an editable patch cube or NURBS cube, you're actually changing it from one type of parametric object to another type. Editable mesh and editable poly are much more explicit. Editable mesh was the first type of polygonal surface which was implemented in Max and has been there since version 1. This was added to much later, I think it was in version 3 or 4, with editable poly, where the underlying engine that drove the polygons was changed and revised. And this allowed quite a few changes and improvements in the modeling system. By default, many of the modifiers in Max will actually convert a parametric object into an editable mesh when you apply them. So this must be borne in mind when you actually apply a modifier. This modification, though, isn't permanent. You can actually remove the modifier, and underneath that modifier, the parametric cube will still be a parametric cube. So this is part of Max's parametric and procedural workflow. Okay, so in this case, I'm actually going to convert this cube into an editable poly, and I'm going to change the tessellation back to 3 rather than 4. I think this will actually be better for what I have in mind. So I right-click on the cube, go to Convert, Editable Poly, and there we go. Immediately on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that the parameters which were available for the parametric cube have gone. And let me actually undo that and do that again so you see exactly what happens. Take notice here that in the modifier panel it also says that it's an editable poly. And as you can see, as I said, the command panel over here hasn't really got quite enough room for the rollouts for this type of geometry. So I'm going to actually pull this window over here and customize it so that we've got 2 columns for the command panel. Okay, so let's undo what I've just done, and you can see it's gone back to a box. So in the modifier list you can see, rather in the stack window, you can see that we have a box, and if I convert it to an editable poly again, you can see it becomes an editable poly, and a plus sign appears to the left of it. If I click on that plus sign, you can see it shows that the editable poly has sub-object types, which is a common interface convention throughout Max, and is also used in modifiers as well. Now in this case, an editable poly is made up on the most basic level of vertices, and you can see that every face on the cube